The subcommittee will come to order. After recognizing myself and Ranking Member Deutsch for 5 minutes each for our opening statements, I will then recognize other members seeking recognition for 1 minute or so. We will then hear from our witnesses, and without objection, the witnesses' prepared statements will be made a part of the record, and members may have 5 days to insert statements and questions for the record, subject to the length limitation in the rules. The chair now recognizes herself for 5 minutes. When the Obama administration proposed establishing enterprise funds in Egypt and Tunisia in 2011, I admit that I was skeptical. Previous versions of these U.S.-funded entities, first established by the George H.W. Bush administration following the breakup of the Soviet Union, had a mixed track record. Establishing new funds in Tunisia, and especially in Egypt, where the Muslim Brotherhood had just taken power, seemed like a risky proposition. So despite a rocky start, I'm happy to say that these funds have made some positive progress. And one thing we learned from the previous reviews and hearings on enterprise funds is that the capabilities of each fund's chairman and board of directors may be the single most determining factor of that success. So I commend both Jim and Bo for their tremendous work over the past few years. We're grateful to each of you gentlemen for your time and for your leadership. And as Jim and Bo lay out in their written testimony, the road getting here was not easy, especially working in two countries with rapidly changing political conditions, difficult regulatory environments, and in need of serious economic reforms. Although both funds are still in relatively early stages, it is an opportune time to provide congressional oversight and take a look at how each fund is fulfilling its dual mandate, making a profit and developing their respective private sectors. In Egypt, we're finally seeing some positive economic signs after years of being on what seemed to be the edge of a crisis. Foreign direct investment is increasing, investors are buying Egyptian bonds, and the foreign currency shortage has abated. With difficult austerity measures already in place, it is critical that President Sisi continue to make the hard decisions necessary for long-term growth. In Tunisia, the government is also taking important steps to reform the economy, including raising interest rates and launching an initiative to tackle corruption. In addition to corruption, however, there are still many other concerns, including underemployment of educated Tunisians, an extremely high unemployment rate among working-age youth, and a tourist sector that still has not recovered from several devastating terrorist attacks. Reforming the economy in both Egypt and Tunisia is no easy task, and it's going to take an extraordinary amount of political will from each of their governments, in addition to international assistance, to make the necessary changes. That is one reason why so many people are excited about the prospect of these enterprise funds and the economic assistance opportunities that they can provide. In Egypt's case, the Sisi government continues to prevent programming of regular U.S. economic assistance through both international and domestic NGOs, and we still have a backlog of hundreds of millions of economic support fund dollars. And in the case of Tunisia, I'm concerned that we are not providing the level of assistance that is required to meet U.S. stability and security goals in the region. The President's proposed cuts to both the FMF and ESF accounts for Tunisia would unnecessarily hinder our ability to assist with our partners' crucial democratic transition. As important U.S. allies, both Egypt and Tunisia's economic well-being are critical to U.S. interests, and it is important that we find ways to support them any way we can. Last month, I was proud to introduce, alongside Ranking Member Deutsch and a number of our colleagues, a bill that would authorize a new enterprise fund for another U.S. ally, Jordan. With the chairman of the Egyptian American and Tunisian American Enterprise Funds here with us today, I am hoping that in addition to answering questions about their funds and addressing any concerns members they have, they also will provide recommendations for setting up a fund in Jordan. While enterprise funds should not be looked upon as a panacea, it is clear that they can be powerful drivers of economic growth, and spur the necessary development of sustainable private sectors and turn a profit at the same time. I look forward to hearing our witnesses' thoughts about enterprise funds as a foreign policy tool, as well as any lessons that they may have learned along the way. And now I'm honored to turn to my ranking member, Mr. Deutsch of Florida.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, for holding this hearing today to highlight the work that these two American programs are doing through USAID and in partnership with local leaders and governments. I'm grateful to you both, Mr. Harmon and Mr. Cutter, for taking the time to come here and shine a light on the role these funds are playing in advancing American interests and fostering prosperity abroad. I just want to say that as the chairman and I and our staffs prepared for this hearing, one thing was abundantly clear, and that is that it is because of the leadership of both of you that these funds have been successful, and you do this all pro bono, so we're especially grateful for your service. Even as we consider the challenges that you face operating in countries where bureaucracy moves slowly and corruption is still rampant, the successes of the Egyptian and Tunisian American enterprise funds deserve to be acknowledged, not only as standalone programs, but as examples of innovative U.S. policy. While USAID serves many roles through many different approaches, the structure and approach of the EAEF and TAEF are indicative of the new direction that the United States Development Assistance has taken under the leadership of Congress and previous administrations. Congress established the Egyptian and Tunisian American Enterprise Funds in order to back local innovation, support local entrepreneurs, and strengthen local institutions. This focus on in-country capacity reflects the new emphasis of U.S. foreign assistance laid out under the USAID Forward Initiative, which was begun in 2010. By spending our money through carefully vetted local banks and businesses, as the EAEF and TAEF are doing, we multiply the impact of the dollars spent by achieving the goal of economic growth while also building enduring institutions. The funds rely on the knowledge of experts from the private sector, are working to strengthen small and medium enterprises in Tunisia and key sectors in Egypt. Both TAEF and EAF have worked hard to build their boards of directors and learn about the investment climate in each country. And while some have questioned the slow pace of investments, it seems as if both of you learned lessons from the European funds of the 90s and worked to correct many of the mistakes that were made in the past. Over the past decade, United States assistance has emphasized accountability and returns on investment. The American enterprise funds in Tunisia and Egypt are good examples of this principle in action. They seek tangible returns to be reinvested into local businesses, and they open their books to regular audits in the interest of transparency. In 2015, the GAO issued recommendations for USAID to increase its oversight of these funds, all of the recommendations which have now been implemented. We look forward to hearing more from both of you how the vetting and oversight process works. Aid dollars are a finite resource, and the United States has redoubled its efforts to spend them in areas where they will best advance our national interest. Security and stability in these countries is critical, and economic turmoil feeds instability. Tunisia was the birthplace of the Arab Spring, and its young democracy can be a model for other nations seeking to move from authoritarianism and oppression to democracy and freedom, but we must address the root causes of the uprising, namely an overeducated, underemployed youth population, which is a focus of the Enterprise Fund, as I understand it. I'll look forward to hearing from you about that. I'm deeply concerned about the proposed cuts to security assistance to Tunisia that might undermine progress being made in building democratic institutions and strengthening the economy. In Egypt, the relationship with the United States is longstanding, and it's of major strategic importance, but it can be fraught with tension, particularly when it comes to spending USAID dollars. Support for these funds demonstrates the increasingly bipartisan support that international development has enjoyed in Congress. The TAEF and EAEF are examples of the broad support for the important work of international development that I hope will continue in Congress, even as this White House attempts to dramatically reduce American engagement abroad. There has been a clear effort to make America's development work more efficient and more focused, and at a time when agencies like USAID and OPIC are finding their very existence being threatened by President Trump, it is good for us to remember that fact. In many ways, the Egyptian and Tunisian American Enterprise Funds reflect this new direction, and I'm eager to discuss their individual successes as well as their work as part of a broader conversation, reaffirming the longstanding American commitment to a fully engaged foreign policy. Again, welcome to the witnesses, and thank you, Madam Chairman.
Thank you very much. Excellent opening statement, Mr. Deutsch, as always. And now I'm pleased to recognize members for any opening statements they might have, and we will start with Mr. Issa of California.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm really looking forward to this for a reason that perhaps hasn't yet been explained. Our use of NGOs in these countries, Tunisia and particularly Egypt, has been problematic on the political side. There can be little doubt but that our NGOs operating in the best interest of democracy were actually part of putting the Muslim Brotherhood into the role they had by developing naive, liberal political organizations that thought that the problem in Egypt was the WTO, that in fact the problem in Egypt was corruption alone. Rather than looking at the narrow band of water that makes up the historic economy of Egypt, they simply looked and blamed outside forces. An NGO that works on enterprise can help solve that, and I'm looking forward to the continued progress. But as I close, I think it's important that we understand, unlike the Marshall Plan at the end of World War II, which took historic industries and helped restore them, and historic skills and help put them back to work, we cannot, in fact, put Tunisians and Egyptians back to work in cotton and in other areas that have historically been part of their economy. They will not support the workforce, in the case of Egypt, of over 87 million people. We have to be part of those new enterprises, being the enterprises of the 21st century and not the 19th or 20th. And Madam Chair, thank you very much for your indulgence.
Good point. Thank you, Mr. Issa. Mr. Shabbat is recognized.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. The Egyptian and Tunisian economies have been pretty abysmal for the past several years. In Egypt, we've watched the public debt and unemployment rates rise significantly in recent years, while Tunisia has faced a litany of obstacles, including terrorist threats to their tourism sector, among other things. Unfortunately, the economic strife has discouraged young Egyptians and Tunisians from participating in the economy. And as many of my colleagues know, the young and unemployed are ripe for conversion by ideological extremists. This is just one of the reasons why I believe it's imperative that we continue to encourage these countries to take the necessary steps to attract further investment and stimulate the economy. Enterprise funds are one of the tools at their disposal. By leveraging the private sector, providing technical assistance to entrepreneurs, and offering equity investments, enterprise funds can help facilitate real economic improvements in both Egypt and Tunisia, and in fact other countries as well. And I would just note, Madam Chair, I apologize, we have a markup in Judiciary, then I have to chair the Small Business Committee at 11, so I will review the testimony.
Thank you so much, Mr. Shabbat. Don't worry about it, and I'm going to introduce Ambassador Wagner, who will soon take over from me while I go to the Intelligence Committee open hearing on Russia. So I'm now proud to recognize Ambassador Wagner for her opening statement.
Well, I thank you, Madam Chairman, and I will tell you that I will waive my opening statement because I have a good deal of questions, and just to move the process along, I will yield back to the chair.
Thank you so much, Ms. Wagner, and I'm going to introduce the witnesses, and then if you could take over for me, that would be great. And first, we are delighted to welcome Mr. James Harmon, Chairman of the Egyptian American Enterprise Fund. Mr. Harmon is also Chairman and Chief Investment Officer of Caravel Management. Prior to working for Caravel Management, he served as Chairman, President, and CEO of the Export-Import Bank of the United States from 1997 to 2001. Mr. Harmon, thank you for coming. We all look forward to your testimony. And next, we want to welcome Mr. Bowman Cutter, Chairman of the Tunisian American Enterprise Fund. He is also a Senior Fellow and Director of the Economic Policy Initiative at the Roosevelt Institute. Mr. Cutter served with distinction during 2 Democratic presidencies at the National Economic Council and at the Office of Management and Budget. Mr. Cutter, thank you for coming. We look forward to your testimony as well, and your prepared statements will be made a part of the record. And I have read it, so don't think I'm skipping out on that, and I hope to come back in time for some questions. Thank you, Ms. Wagner, for stepping in for me. Hold on one second.
Mr. Harmon, you're recognized. Could you please hit the green button?
Thank you very much.
There you go. Thank you.
So, Madam Chair and Acting Chair, ranking members and members of the subcommittee, thank you for holding this hearing and for inviting me to testify. In January of 2012, the White House and the State Department called and asked me to take on this particular assignment. Some few months later, I started the process of visiting former chairs of enterprise funds. I visited 6 of them, and to the man, they said, why would you want to do this? The challenges you have between the Egyptian and the U.S. is so great. We didn't have those challenges in the European enterprise funds back in the 1990s, and they pointed out all of the difficulties. It actually proved to be a good reason why I would take on this assignment, because we could do a lot better in building relationships between Egypt and the United States. In March of 2013, we signed the grant agreement with USAID. That year, we made a critical decision not to place Americans in Cairo to seek and manage investments. We were fortunate indeed to meet a very talented Egyptian investment banker who would prove critical to the success we have had to date. He organized a management company, Lorax, to lead the search for and management of the Egyptian American Enterprise Fund assets. In time, he would add 7 additional professionals. Only 3 years later, it is on the way to becoming one of the leading private equity managers in Egypt. In 2013, we organized a board of directors in compliance with the legislation. Credit to Congress for its guidelines and the terms of our grant agreement. 3 Egyptians and 6 Americans, 3 of whom are Egyptian American. This board has been highly engaged in our efforts. None of the board members receive compensation for their time. We are grateful to our directors for their service and dedication. And 2 years ago, we were fortunate to recruit an Egyptian woman who was graduated from the Harvard Business School, who had prior experience at the Ministry of Finance in Egypt. And she came in and has become our director in New York City, and who is sitting behind me. I'm grateful for the good work that she has done. Egypt's private sector remains underdeveloped. It suffers from a gap in financing, infrastructure, and talent. This curbs its ability to expand and grow the economy. An underdeveloped private sector results in underserved markets, high unemployment rates, and low financial inclusion. Egypt has the largest population in the Arab world and the 3rd largest in Africa. The youth accounts for 44% of the population, of which 31.3% are unemployed, leaving 51% of the population living in poverty. Alarmingly high unemployment rates are a great loss of human talent, a growing burden on the economy, and a threat to social stability, all of which hinder the country from realizing its full potential. Furthermore, only 13.7% of the population owns a bank account, which represents one of the lowest financial inclusion rates in the Middle East and around the world. Small to medium-sized enterprises account for 99.6% of the companies in Egypt. However, they are greatly underserved, especially in the financial sector, limiting their ability to scale. It is rare for anyone to hit a home run in their first at-bat, but I think we did it with our first investment for the fund. Fowry, Egypt's largest electronic bill payments platform. Fowry extends basic financial services to Egypt's unbanked population and promotes financial inclusion, a major part of our mission. Traditionally, Egyptians have had to wait hours in line to pay their bills in cash. Fowry's digital platform saves time for consumers by allowing them to not only make payments and pay bills, but also to add credit to their cell phone accounts, buy plane tickets, and other services. It does this via its online website and its more than 65,000 kiosks located across the countries. In 5 years' time, this little company, which started with no Egyptian customers, now has 20 million Egyptians using the service. It is my prediction that within the next 5 years, half the population of Egypt will be using the Fowry service. So it's a good illustration where technology has played a critical role for the developing countries, and particularly for Egypt. In 2015, we also made a large investment in Sarwa Capital, a consumer finance company that extends financial services such as lending to SMEs and to Egypt's large unbanked population. In fact, since our investment, it has provided loans to 9,000 new clients, mainly to Egyptian youth, to help finance, for example, finishing and furnishing new homes, which would otherwise be unaffordable to this growing group. Half of the Sarwa clients did not have a bank account before receiving a loan from Sarwa. Sarwa also provides funding to several hundred SMEs, which help to meet our commitment to creating jobs and improving the lives of Egyptians by providing access to financing. Last but not least, we have seeded a venture capital fund, Tamia Capital Ventures, that invests in small and medium-sized enterprises and Egyptian entrepreneurs. By investing in this new venture and other VC firms, we are enabling new fund managers to seek our investments not only in Cairo, but across Egypt, even in more rural locations. So we have invested today $100 million, and we have brought in an additional $100 million from two institutions that had heretofore not invested in Egypt. It is my expectation that we will invest an additional $100 million by the end of this year. So we will have invested $200 million of the original $300 and another $100 that we have brought in. I would add that these investments come as the Egyptian government has embarked on an ambitious economic reform agenda that has seen the phasing out of long overdue energy subsidies and a floating of the Egyptian pound. And to their credit, the signing of the agreement with the IMF, a $12 billion loan to Egypt. The Egyptian government deserves additional credit for all these tough but necessary decisions. I think the fund will produce significant profits over its life. It is my opinion that upon liquidation, proceeds should go to return to the United States its original capital, and thereafter profits should be divided between both our countries. Finally, economic development is critical to the growth and prosperity of developing countries. Enterprise funds, with their development mission, can be an important weapon in the war on terror. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Harmon, for your testimony and opening statement. Mr. Cutter, you're now recognized for 6 minutes. Thank you.
Chairman, thank you. I will cough my way through the presentation. I want to thank...
Again, could I please ask you to hit the green button and move your mic a little bit closer to your mouth, sir? Thank
Okay,
you.
is this now?
Perfect.
I have cough drops, which is... thank you very much for holding this hearing and for taking the time to be part of it. It's an honor to be at the hearing, and I should say right at the onset that it's an honor to chair the Tunisian American Enterprise Fund. I was delighted to have been asked, and I'm delighted at serving over the last 5 years and at what we've accomplished. I probably should simply include by reference most or all of my friend Mr. Harmon's presentation, since our experiences in significant ways parallel his, as you'll find at the questioning session. So I'll talk more about mission and strategy. Turning first to our mission, we're expected to function as a private sector institution, to invest our funds in the private sector of Tunisia and to be a partner in the revitalization of the Tunisian economy, to help a focus on employment, on women entrepreneurs, on young people, and on geographic diversity, and to earn a profit. We are an investment fund, not a grant-making program. Moving to strategy, in brief, our strategy has been an exclusive focus on Tunisia's small and medium enterprise sector. I should underline that I firmly believe that for all countries, a healthy SME sector is the magic bullet. It is the key to true and equitable economic growth. In Tunisia, the U.S., and everywhere else. My TAF, Tunisian American Enterprise Fund colleagues, and I have tried from the start to be both rigorous and innovative in finding ways to invest across the full spectrum of this sector. So let me say how we invest across the sector. To invest in the smallest of enterprises, and I have in mind here the pushcart businesses, the really tiny family enterprises. We've helped to finance Tunisia's quite new, brand new microfinance efforts. We've invested both debt and equity in these microfinance businesses. We've helped them define their operations and think through how to deal with very small enterprises. Through our board, we bring enormous expertise in microfinance, and I think our Tunisian colleagues would say that we've been extremely helpful in helping shape that industry. Second, to invest in the whole middle range of the SME sector. And these would be businesses ranging from roughly $150,000 a year in annual revenue to perhaps $2 million a year in annual revenue. And as in Egypt, it is this core which is probably close to 99% of the GDP of all of the businesses in Tunisia. We created our own investment vehicle, which is called TASME, the Tunisian American Small and Medium Enterprise Company. Through this vehicle, we're pioneering in Tunisia a new and an innovative approach, which has been quite well received and allows us to tailor investment to the precise needs of entrepreneurs. As one example, one of our investments is a very high-quality date processing business in the south of Tunisia, a region that has seen almost no real private sector activity and that badly needs economic growth. Another is in a porcelain manufacturing business. A third manufactures customized packaging. We have a long pipeline now and investing at a quite high rate. And finally, to reach the top end of the SME sector, businesses with, say, $10 million in annual revenue, we've partnered with high-quality Tunisian business people. We helped create a fund called Croissance, which is growth in French, and through it leveraged other money from other institutions, and we're now in the process of creating with others a follow-on fund that will also leverage equal amounts of money. We are, and this is, I hope that Mr. Issa is able to see or read this part of my presentation. We're testing the opportunity for true startups in Tunisia. We've partnered with others in Tunisia and with an Egyptian firm to create the first full-scale incubation, acceleration, and financing effort for startups in Tunisia. Our first class of startup businesses and entrepreneurs begins in the first week of July. We narrowed down to 8 people who will enter our class from 200 proposals that we received in mid-March. We plan to start a new class every quarter for the next several years. We see this is the first effort in Tunisia to create a kind of full-blown ecology for startups. None of this is without challenges, and I've thought about the challenges as falling into 3 baskets. First, what we're doing is essentially a complete from-scratch startup of a financial business. This doesn't differ much operationally in my experience, from any other startup, including enormous time demands. We're doing it in the area of finance, as Mr. Harmon, which in both the U.S. and in Tunisia involves grappling with enormously complicated regulatory systems, which we have to comply with at every step along the way. Second, within the U.S. government system, enterprise funds are unfamiliar animals. When the first set of them, the first tranche of them, were negotiated and put together in the Bush 1 administration, like Mr. Harmon, I know and have talked to almost all of the previous chairs, but there's been little institutional memory over the 25 years from then to now. And I think I would, and we can talk about this, that our principal difficulties at the start were really were the absence of an institutional memory. And I hope now that's been codified. And finally, it's fair to say that the Tunisian administrative bureaucracy is particularly difficult. I've had the enormous good fortune of working with Tunisian government officials who are extremely supportive of America and who understand what we're trying to do. But it doesn't make the bureaucratics any easier. Basic Tunisian law works on different principles than American common law, and more importantly, Tunisia endured for a generation a kleptocratic ruler, which ate the heart out of the center of the Tunisian economy. As a result, the Tunisian financial sector requires vast reform. They are embarking on that. I talk to government officials all of the time. I understand what it is they're trying to do, but in the meantime, we have to figure out how to operate within it. I'll conclude by reflecting on enterprise funds, although obviously I really only understand just one. They're important economic development tools. They're valuable both for the host company and for America. And while I'm not a scholar, and I hate even to mention the word terror, I think that building economies that work for ordinary people, which is the heart of what we're trying to do, is one of the best ways to combat extremism. It's not trivial to emphasize that these funds can be supported by the American taxpayer because they can be run at a profit. I'll underline the last point. We make our investments only after rigorous due diligence. We track our investees carefully. We know they will experience ups and downs. We haven't yet, but we know we will see failure. And we fully expect at the end of this to earn a modest profit when we're finished. And we expect upon liquidation that it will be dealt with in the same way that Jim Harmon posed at the end. Thank you very much.
I thank you, Mr. Cutter, for your testimony and your opening statement. We'll make sure that Representative Issa
Thank you.
sees every word of it. I now recognize myself in the capacity of the chair for 5 minutes. Promoting financial stability and building the capacity of the private sector in the Middle East and North Africa are key concerns of the U.S. government, and I appreciate Mr. Cutter and Mr. Harmon for their hard work in managing the enterprise funds. Mr. Cutter, unemployment in Tunisia may be as high as 37.6% among working-age youth, and there is a real lack of high-skilled jobs. To what extent is the Enterprise Fund focused on addressing those needs, and what steps can the Tunisian government take to reduce the youth unemployment rate and create more high-skilled jobs?
I'll try not to filibuster. I'll be short, but I'm happy to engage in this as long as you would like. It's a very, very important topic. May I say first that I would be suspicious of any Tunisian statistic that has a decimal point in it. I don't think that...
I'll round up to 38.
I don't think anybody knows, but I certainly take your point that it's way, way too high. I don't think that the answer to this kind of unemployment problem stems from a magic bullet. I don't think there's going to be one giant investment that solves that. It is going to come because the SME sector works better. To be trivial about it, if there are 500,000 Tunisian small businesses and every one of them hires 10 or 20 people, you have solved the problem. But and that speaks to the guts of the problem, which is that the SME sector is heavily burdened. It has not been the focus of government effort, and for 30 years, it was essentially the source of depredation by governments. Mm-hmm. There is far too much casual corruption, which this government today has made a big deal of, but corruption really is a tax on particularly small businesses. Every step along the way of creating a business or running a business has some tiny amount of corruption attached to it. And one of the great benefits of a enterprise fund is we know this. We talk to the entrepreneurs all the time. They tell us this. So there is the problem that the SME sector has not been a focus. There is the corruption, and it is quite hard to do business in Tunisia.
Thank you, Mr. Cutter. I've got several more questions. And Mr. Bowman, I understand that half of all EAEF investment is in one company, Sarwa Capital. This company offers consumer credit services to finance auto loans, home furnishings, insurance, and basically general consumer spending. Are these services utilized by Egyptians from all social classes, or just by those who already are considered middle to upper middle class? And why has this particular company received such a substantial amount of funding? Button, please.
Thank you. I think we realized very early, you cannot solve this problem by going out and trying to put small amounts of money into various different small businesses in Egypt, in our opinion. We needed to have a vehicle that could reach thousands and thousands of Egyptians. 31% or so of the youth population is unemployed. So our first preference was to look for a bank, but we were not allowed to do that. So we bought a consumer finance business, which was in a position through its auto activities, its leasing activities, to reach the small and middle-sized enterprises. So I would say through Sarwa, we have now most recently reached some 9,000 SMEs, and we are reaching a very significant amount of SMEs. We could not do it any other way without using some kind of vehicle. But an active, growing consumer finance business can reach out. We had some of the same problems when I was at the Exim Bank. We didn't know how to reach in sub-Saharan Africa the large number of smaller enterprise funds, and the banks didn't want to make loans to them. So we had to find a vehicle. We lent money then to that vehicle, and that vehicle on-lent it to the many SMEs that were in all over sub-Saharan Africa. But that is the approach we've taken in Egypt, and I think over a period of time we will reach a large number of the SMEs in Egypt on one way or other that will help them to provide the funding. SMEs do not have the funding, obviously, and the banks don't want to loan money to them.
All right, thank you, Mr. Harmon. I will continue until our ranking member returns. Mr. Cutter, my home state is Missouri, and agriculture is very important to us, so I was interested in your insights on the Tunisian agriculture industry. As foreign investors in Tunisia cannot own agricultural land, how have agricultural restrictions impacted the fund's activity?
As I said in the prepared testimony, it precludes, this provision precludes some investment because you simply cannot, some you simply can't manage around. And in others, it has required us, working through Tunisian regulatory authorities, to essentially structure a deal so that an investment, so that we're investing in the non-agricultural part and we can show that we have no ownership of the land.
Are you having success in dealing with the Tunisian government in this regard?
Yes, but we haven't been able to change the basic law. And I think the basic law is a holdover from a long time ago when there were colonial attitudes about buying and owning land, and I think they're an anachronism.
Thank you. Mr. Harmon, what impact have terrorist incidents, the fear of terrorism, and political uncertainty had on the operations of the enterprise funds in Egypt? And to what extent has the political environment discouraged other investors and sources of credit for the private sector?
Significantly. Tourist business was down at one point as much as 50%.
50, 50?
50 at one point. It's coming back a little bit now. Tourist business is still impacted and a very important part of Egyptian economy. We talk all the time about what we're going to do about that, and we are exploring right now with a major hotel chain there, creating a school for training young Egyptians on hotel activities as a way to create jobs, but also as a way to stimulate the growth of the hotel business. But there's no question that terror has frightened foreign direct investors and frightened visitors. We've come a ways in the last 6 months. The agreement with the IMF, which is a credit to the Egyptian government, the decision to let the currency float, which meant a significant decline in the value, credit to our investments, that our investments are still worth more than what we paid even after the devaluation. But the devaluation makes traveling to Egypt much cheaper. So people are looking, obviously, closer at the opportunities to travel there. I suspect that if they can manage to keep terror from reappearing, that the tourist business will return to Egypt. But all of this had an impact on the Egyptian economy, and only now, with the program that President Sisi has done, which is not only the IMF agreement, but the international loan that was done, which was very successfully received, and a number of other moves at the cabinet level. There's one particular minister, the Minister of International Cooperation, Minister Sahar, has done a very good job, understands what the enterprise is doing, understands the issues that we're talking about now. So good people at the government level and the kinds of reforms that the government have taken will lead to a recovery of the economy. Now, it's interesting that the Enterprise Fund is somewhat of a beneficiary. We invested at the low point, so it didn't take a genius to invest well when we did it. I think that we will show very significant profits as a result of that. But our goal is more than just showing profits. Our goal is how do we help on the development side to bring in more investors, which is one of our major efforts by seeding other funds that we will do that. But there's no doubt that that the terror activities there had a major impact.
Well, and to that point, Mr. Harmon, foreign direct investment in Egypt, it's no secret, has rebounded from a significant dip in late, probably 2015. What developments have contributed most significantly to this increase in FDI, and how is the EAEF taking advantage of this?
Well, the most important thing is what I alluded to a moment ago, and that is the agreement with the IMF, which, concurrent with allowing the currency to float, that meant that the Egyptian pound is down very significantly, and that meant it was much more attractive to invest. It slowed up the enterprise fund from investing. Our two major first investments and a few other smaller ones, then the management, knowing that there was a devaluation coming, we paused. Now we're back into the market, which is why I think we, as well as other investors, will invest more actively in Egypt. And we brought along these two major institutions for $100 million, which invested. Many other institutions from around the world come and visit us now in New York or in Cairo and ask, is it the right time to invest in Egypt? The answer is yes, it is the right time, in my judgment, after the devaluation, because it's much cheaper to invest. So I would predict that you would see foreign direct investment recover more, significantly more. And by the way, the market in Egypt, the stock market, has also done very well. All of this speaks well. Now, we have to do more, obviously, in order to help create jobs and help on the development side. But I'm cautiously optimistic about the economy now.
All right, thank you, Mr. Harmon. Final question here, Mr. Cutter. In your testimony, you wrote that flexible funding is important to the success of the enterprise fund. Are there additional ways to improve the fund to make it more flexible?
I hate to be Pollyannish, but from the point of view of what the U.S. could do, I feel as if I have all of the flexibility I need, and shame on me if I can't figure out how to engineer anything. It is the case that, like a lot of financial systems in many countries, the Tunisian financial system is out of date, and there are ways that it could allow more flexibility. And I've made this clear in my testimony, but also in Tunisia.
Thank you very, very much. At this point, the chair will now recognize Mr. Conley, gentleman from Virginia, for 5 minutes.
I thank the chair, and I'm delighted to be with you and all of our colleagues.
I have plenty more questions.
Okay, good. Let me see. Mr. Cutter. No, actually, I'm sorry. Mr. Harmon. Congresswoman Ileana Ros-Lehtinen and I had requested a review of the whole Egyptian assistance program. Have you seen that report?
No.
What percentage of how much and what percentage of our bilateral assistance is in the form of cash grant transfer?
I don't know the answer to that question. I can only tell you that the amount that's been allocated at the Egyptian American Enterprise Fund, we have received $212 million. We expect to receive the full $300 million. The amount of financial aid to Egypt for economic assistance has been declining, so it has been cut back. I think military has been held even, but the amount, I remember some numbers, but I have to really check to see that, but it has definitely come down.
Well, I used to work on the Hill, and I used to write the Foreign Aid bill on the Senate side when I was a committee staffer a number of years ago, when we started sort of ratcheting up the percentage of the ESF fund that was provided as a cash grant transfer. And I always worried about that, because if we're going to show a peace dividend, for Camp David to the people of Egypt, it's never going to be in the form of a check written to the Egyptian Treasury to, stabilize their budget. I mean, maybe the controller of the Treasury is happy, but the average Egyptian sees none of that. And that was the nature of my question to, where are we today? But that's not something you follow.
It's a very complicated question. On my first visit to Egypt, the Egyptian government kept making the statement that the $300 million that was allocated to the enterprise fund was in fact really money that should be given to the Egyptian government to be spent as they wished to do it. And I debated that point with them. We've since come to some understanding about that. Our investments have been able to reach millions of Egyptians. So on one investment alone, the Fowry investment, where it's a pay, like PayPal is in the United States, it's a pay service, allows Egyptians to pay their bills, borrow a little bit of money on the telephone call. It's changed the life of 20 million Egyptians, and it's growing at such a rate, it will reach, in my judgment, in the next 5 years, 40 million. So half of the population will use this financial service. That's a very important addition that we've been able to do, and we're going to get all of our money back plus a profit on that investment. So we're trying to impact this so-called financial inclusion question. If you take the other investment we made, most of the loans that Sarwa has made were to people who do not have a bank account. 13% of the Egyptians have a bank account. So it's the very smallest number probably of any of the poorest countries in the world. So Egypt needs financial inclusion, and we've been addressing that. We're addressing it in a way which I think the United States is going to get all of its money back. So
when you have 13% of the population with bank accounts, that tells me that the informal economy dominates most people's lives.
yes, that's true. Certainly is true in Egypt. It also tells you that banks don't want to make loans because they can buy treasury securities, which give them 12, 13, 14, 15% return. Why take a risk in making a small business loan? Which is why we sought to make this investment in the consumer finance business, where we now are instructing to take the risk needed to reach the poor and the number of unbanked clients. So we're going after that very market that you're referring to as a way to make a difference. When they write the history book on enterprise funds and on Egypt, I think that will be our most important contribution. It won't be because we made money. It won't be because the United States got its money back. It's because we made a difference in reaching the average Egyptian and changing the quality of life for the Egyptians, because we gave them the money that needed for them to finish their home, for them to buy an auto, or for them to do a lot of basic things.
My time is almost running out, but I want to, presumably you're involved in tourism industry in some fashion. Can you tell us a little bit about what's happening to tourism in Egypt? Because it's such a huge source of foreign exchange. And presumably the current climate has depressed tourism in Egypt.
So the tourist business dropped 50%.
50%.
50. That's a huge drop in any country. I mean, the Western world has never experienced anything, the magnitude of that kind of percentage decline. Now, you have to factor in there was the various different terror attacks, specifically cutting back on Russian tourists and cutting back on most Western tourists. If I tell people on my very first trip to Egypt, I sometimes in a loose moment explain to them, I was there, oddly enough, to meet with the Muslim Brotherhood, and I had a meeting that night, and security took me in a car with two of the young people from the State Department. We went in front of the square. We were blocked immediately because of the protests. Security said to me, when the tear gas comes, stay in the car because you would not live to get to the corner. For 2.5 hours, we stayed in that car while tear gas was all around us. By the time I got out, needless to say, I was wondering what I ever had agreed to do to take on this assignment. I met with the head of the Muslim Brotherhood, and I leveled in saying, if you're now the leadership of this country, you're never going to attract foreign investment if you can't even drive, if you're frightened about it. I never even shared it with my family. It was such an experience. Now, recent trips are much better. People can go to Egypt and feel comfortable. We've come a long way. But if you live through, I happen to say that was the day of the Benghazi attack, so there was a lot of action going on in Cairo and all over. But That kind of experience and people who saw it and read about it, it will frighten people from going to a country like Egypt. That has changed very significantly because, fortunately, people have a good, fast memory, and because of the IMF agreement and new money coming in and investment pouring in, you can overcome that. But if you have terror, it discourage almost anybody from going. And I think we've come a ways. We still have a further way to go.
And just, if I may, Madam Chairman, just a quick addition. And is it your observation that the Egyptian government has beefed up security at obvious tourist sites?
Yes.
Okay.
I think the Egyptian government doesn't get appropriate credit for a lot of good things they do. Of course, they get criticized for the NGO law. I, too, am saddened by it. But I think what they've done in the financial area in terms of the IMF agreement, in terms of allowing the currency to float, in terms of reducing the subsidies, is to their credit. What they've done on security is also to their credit. So, but you don't read too much about that in the newspaper. Newspapers want to write about the worst part about it, and that's somewhat unfortunate. So I hope in due time there will be further reforms in Egypt on the issues of the NGOs. But right now, they have done good work in security and good work in the financial area.
Great. Thank you so much, and thank you, Madam Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Conley. As was mentioned in the opening statement of our chairman, Ileana Ros-Lehtinen, and the ranking member Deutsch, they recently introduced a bill that would authorize a new enterprise fund in Jordan. Considering your experiences over the past 5 years, is Jordan a good candidate for the enterprise fund? I'll let you decide who would like to answer. Mr. Cutter.
I think it's almost an ideal type.
An ideal type.
An ideal type. It is small enough so an enterprise fund can have enormous effect. It has the beginnings of the right institutions. It has a nascent but reasonably sophisticated, in the sense of being nascent, financial sector, so you can actually function there, and it's receptive to innovation, all of the kinds of things that I've found in Tunisia. So I would have thought, looking across the Middle East, after, obviously because I'm biased after giving preference to Tunisia and to my friend Mr. Harmon and to Egypt, I'd have thought Jordan was where you ought to go next.
Great, thank you. Mr. Cutter, or Mr. Harmon, any addition?
Were I to be in a position to decide where we'd go, I would be more aggressive. We can do enterprise funds so it doesn't cost the taxpayer anything. We are going to have profits in Egypt, so the money will come back to the United States. One. Two, there's a lot of talent available in many of these countries who, working together with someone like Mr. Cutter and myself, could do a very good job running an enterprise fund. So I would go bigger. I would look at Iraq. I would think a lot. I would have a team in the United States government studying which countries we should do it. Which should we consider? Someday, that's a long time from now, but someday we'll do it in Syria. Someday we'll have it in Afghanistan. But I'd have a planning stage right now for all of the failing states. And there are a lot of talent. We would love to participate in such a study group at any time at no cost to the United States government, but there should be more plans for somewhat larger countries because this does not cost us anything to do. So it's almost a no-brainer. There is too much focus, in my judgment, at state or at the Council on Foreign Relations on conflict resolution and not enough focus on economic development. Because if economic development is successful and you create jobs, that's a major force for reducing conflict in the future. Enterprise funds are the model for that.
Thank you, Mr. Harmon. I appreciate your optimism. Many observers have suggested that finding the right chairman and board of directors is the single most important element in achieving long-term development goals and financial profitability of an enterprise fund. What can you tell us about the composition of your boards and how the directors are chosen? Mr. Cutter?
I certainly think, thinking about my colleague, that finding the right chairman is extraordinarily important. Whether or not it applies to me or not, I'll leave it alone. But the our board, I think our board's fantastic. By law, it is 6 American citizens and 3 Tunisian citizens. All of them, they come from diverse backgrounds. All of them are experienced in business. There are quite senior players in the financial industry from the United States and from Tunisia. They've all taken risks in their lives. They've all been entrepreneurs. They understand. I think almost all of them have really focused in particular on the small and medium enterprise sector. Some from the perspective in Tunisia of family businesses of their own, some as investment directions from the United States. So what I've found, and it is a little bit like the board membership of one of these is like the catcher, the shortstop who can't hit but on the other hand can't field, is that these are jobs that don't pay anything but on the other hand take an enormous amount of time. But we've found.
Great, thank you. Mr. Harmon, anything to add on the board and board members? Chairman?
Yes, I would be advising future chairs, when you think of a board, try not to take high-profile people who are very busy, because you need people who can get engaged. And
Workhorses, not show horses.
you need people who are going to work on that. And the first thing we looked for were very big names, and I'm so glad we didn't do it, because the people who really do the work are critical. And they have to have a real interest in the country. So we found that Egyptian Americans were quite valuable, but the Americans that we had some real good prior sector experience. So a board is one of the most important parts of an enterprise fund, much more so than the private sector boards. They're important too, but boards here, if they're engaged, really can help you a lot.
According to the Egyptian Fund's 2015 financial statements, approximately $56 million of its funds were being held in Mauritius. Is this still the case? And what is the rationale for holding funds in Mauritius rather than Egypt and the United States? Mr. Harmon?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the question. If you could say it again.
According to the financial statements of the Egyptians Fund, their 2015 financial statements, they said approximately $56 million of the funds were being held in Mauritius. Is this still the case? And what's the rationale for doing so, for not holding it, I suppose, in Egypt or in the U.S.?
I think part of that might be reflective of the fact that in anticipation of a devaluation, there were funds being held outside the country, because if you were holding Egyptian pounds, you were about to suffer somewhat. There was a long pause in investing, and many companies, and including some that we know very well, kept dollars outside of the country in Mauritius, waiting for the devaluation to take place, which took place really only last 6 months ago. Then money came out as coming back into Egypt right now. So there was conservatism in keeping money in banks in Mauritius, as an example, as one of the explanations.
Do either of your funds hold cash or own companies outside of your host countries or the U.S., Mr. Cutter?
No.
No.
Mr. Harmon? My last question would be, finally, it's my understanding that the Egyptian Fund is still waiting on a delayed tranche of funding from USAID. What can you tell me about this?
I think you really have to ask state and AID about it rather than myself. We have a pipeline right now where we're ready to make investments. So, but in fairness to them, that pipeline didn't exist until maybe the last 4 or 5 months as we maximized our efforts after the devaluation. So there may have been some reason to feel that we weren't going to employ it quickly enough, but right now, I hope that it will get dispersed to us so that we can accelerate our investment program now that we have the pipeline that we're having. If I may be allowed just to correct one thing I said earlier, I didn't want to imply to anyone that I wasn't supportive of the Jordan Enterprise Fund. I think it's very worthwhile to do. I just felt that we could also be reaching to even larger size, and I also would wanted to encourage a little bit more study of how many other countries we could do enterprise funds in. If I were running the program, I would expand the enterprise fund the whole concept very significantly.
Great. Thank you very much. Mr. Connolly, anything else?
Just could with Mr. Cutter, Madam Chairman. Ms. Cutter, you've been involved in Tunisia for how long? In what? How long have you been involved in Tunisia?
5 years.
5 years. You go there a lot?
Yes,
You think it's an important relationship?
absolutely.
So any comments on the proposed budget the President has submitted that would cut aid to Tunisia by 62%?
I try my best to stay out of politics with respect to the fund, but I think it's short-sighted. That Tunisia is strategically important. The Tunisian government, if you kind of run down a list of the kinds of things that you'd use it as indicators of countries you ought to invest in: 2 free elections, an open liberal constitution, the most open society in the Arab world to women's rights, all of the economic indicators turning up, a recent IMF agreement, a real anti-corruption direction, and financial reform. This is a country we should invest in.
And that litany you've just read, and I'm sure we could add to it, all of that's after the Arab Spring.
Yes, sir.
And it's the only country emerging from that big, hopeful turmoil.
I think Egypt has a
it's
pretty
the
good
only-
shot,
yeah,
but you're right.
But it's the only one that kind of had a happy ending from a democratic point of view.
Absolutely. And if you talk to people in Tunisia now, the mood from the top levels of the government all the way down to the entrepreneurs we deal with, some of whom are just street entrepreneurs, the mood is up in a way that was really quite different 2 years ago.
Sounds like a country we ought to be supporting, not cutting back in. Thank you.
May I say one other thing?
You certainly
I
can.
forgot to mention that particularly given your background, I'm an 8th-generation Virginian from Augusta County, Virginia.
Good for you.
A kissing cousin, Mr. Connolly.
Lord Almighty, Madam Chairman, I should have come earlier.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Connolly. And I thank our witnesses very, very much for their testimony. I know that the ranking member, I just received a note, has been held up in the judiciary markup. We have a number of markups going on this morning. I'm running to one in financial services myself. Do know that we are grateful for the work that you're doing. We're grateful for your testimony here today. And I know that other members will be submitting questions in writing. So with that, the Subcommittee on Middle East and North Africa stands in adjournment.
Thank you very much.